This is Olivia Enos from the Heritage Foundation.
Today, it is believed that between 1.8 and 3 million Uyghurs are being held in political re-education facilities there. And they have been essentially collectivized and sent to these camps for the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party ensuring that they sort of align, if you will, with the Chinese Communist Party's vision for how China should go forward. So people inside of these camps are subject to forced indoctrination, essentially forsaking many of their closely held religious beliefs as well as their ethnic and heritage-oriented practices. And there have been reports of individuals inside of these camps being subject to torture. Some have died while they've been held in prison, and others have disappeared. Now many are saying that they believe that what is taking place inside of these camps, especially some of the more egregious forms of violations like restrictions on birth, forced sterilization, forced implantation of IUDs, and otherwise, may constitute an intent to destroy in whole or in part the Uyghur ethnic minority, which means that genocide and crimes against humanity may be taking place.
It seems like such an important topic to be discussing in the international community, yet it is not on the front page of American newspapers. It is not at the top of our news broadcast. Why do you think that is? Is it a lack of ability for media to actually get to this part of China to tell the story, or is it something else?
You know, I think the Chinese Communist Party would love nothing more than to bury the lead on this story. And I think that international news and media need to do all that they can to cover it. I think, you know, a big part of the reason why this doesn't get a focus is, and it sounds a little bit trite to say it, but Uyghur is hard to pronounce. Xinjiang is hard to pronounce, maybe even difficult to remember. And we don't see pictures emerging because these activities, these events are something that the Chinese Communist Party wants to keep hidden. But we know as we keep seeing and hearing and listening to testimony from Uyghurs who have managed to get out of those camps or were released from those camps, that what they're facing is no ordinary hardship. So I think there's a strong need to elevate those voices and to really just put a face and a name on the crisis. And I think that, you know, there are several very, very, you know, well-known but not covered too frequently individuals who are trying to do just that. One of them is actually a friend of mine. Her name is Ziba Murat, and her mother, Gulshan Abbas, has been held in a political re-education camp for more than 2 years now. As of September 11th, she had not talked to her mom in 2 years. This is all too common for Uyghurs and Uyghur Americans who have family members that have disappeared. And so I think it's definitely time to shine a spotlight on it and make clear to the Chinese Communist Party that they're not going to get away with carrying out genocide and crimes against humanity.
Are there any acts being done by the Trump administration to increase the pressure on the Chinese government when it comes to their treatment of the Uyghur population? And is the international community taking enough steps to use sanctions or other means to put their own pressure? You know, I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, the responsibility will simply lay on the United States as an international actor to ensure that human rights aren't being abused in many parts of the world. But this is something that needs approached, I think, from many different angles. And I imagine that amid these conversations of trade with China and even the upcoming Olympics, the conversations aren't focused on the Uyghur population. They're focused on these other sort of bilateral deals that are being cut. So what is the Trump administration doing, and what should U.S. allies around the world be doing as well?
Well, we've seen the Trump administration take some really important first steps to respond to the crisis. One of the most notable was the sanctioning of Chen Guangguo, who's the Xinjiang Party secretary. He is the same person who is responsible for the human rights violations taking place in Xinjiang. He, to some extent architected the surveillance state that made it possible to collectivize and intern the millions of Uyghurs that are there today. And ironically enough, he carried out many of these same forms of abuses on a smaller scale in the context of Tibet. And so this was really a positive step. He and other Chinese Communist Party officials, as well as key entities who played a role in this, were sanctioned. We've also seen the Trump administration targeting imports that are believed to be produced by forced labor that originated in Xinjiang. This is really positive because it's sending a clear message that the U.S. will not allow goods produced with forced labor to make their way into the U.S. market, nor will they allow the Chinese Communist Party to profit off of those violations and exploitation. However, I think that the Trump administration has stopped short of calling a spade a spade. We need to have an atrocity determination that says that either genocide or crimes against humanity are taking place, or that both genocide and crimes against humanity are taking place. And I think issuing such a declaration has the potential to spur on follow-on actions, like, for example, extending priority to refugee status to Uyghurs who would seek to resettle and flee the Chinese Communist Party's wrath. Or also, as you rightly mentioned, we should really be pressing on the International Olympic Committee to reconsider China's suitability to host Olympics in 2022. It's so important to remember that hosting the Olympics is a privilege. It's not a right. And a genocidal regime like the Chinese Communist Party should not be rewarded by getting to host such a privileged event.
The big question that I'm always asking amid these stories is, how do you make people care? And you touched on it a little bit at the beginning, familiarizing people with the language and the terms surrounding the atrocities that are happening. And I think you also touched on the fact that this really has to be an approach from every angle to raise awareness on this issue. For you, day to day, what does this topic look like in terms of the interaction with your work? Are you researching? Are you, looking for ways to raise awareness? Where has your focus been on this issue?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think that that's a question on the minds of many when it comes to advocating for those who are having their human rights violated. How do you raise concerns over human rights violations in Xinjiang, or concerns over all persons of faith who are being persecuted in China, or, for that matter, let's go outside of China. How do you raise awareness about genocide and crimes against humanity taking place against Rohingya Muslims from Burma, or about the 80,000 to 120,000 individuals inside political prison camps in North Korea? And I think the answer to this is, until statesmen, until policymakers see addressing human rights violations as a broader part of their strategic goals, they see it as actually advancing American interests. I think until they see it as such, many people will refuse to act. And I think it's unfortunate that many of the human rights violations have not been viewed in the broader elements of strategic national security and foreign policy. I think the U.S. has long stood as a beacon for liberty, and that our embrace of those values actually advances our own foreign policy priorities. And so I think that's why we need to prioritize those issues. And when I do my day-to-day work, I try to think about the linkages that exist between those various issues. And I think, in the Chinese context, it's really clearly illustrated in the Trump administration's stated free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a commitment to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific that requires the promotion of values to achieve those ends. And I think that the United States needs to demonstrate that our values, which are shared values, by the way, they're not Western values, these are inherent fundamental rights, need to be preserved, not just here in the U.S., but also in Asia. And so I hope that's, an area of focus going forward, and that concerns over Xinjiang, particularly if this is genocide and crimes against humanity that are taking place, that no diplomat, that no American statesman or woman can talk about China without raising the severe concern over the human rights violations taking place in Xinjiang.